We're here for the final session before we break for lunch. And I have the pleasure of introducing a panel to you on open source model infrastructure. And so when it comes to that infrastructure, open or closed, that is the question. And I'm really stretching the Shakespearean reference here. But it's going to be an incredible panel today, straight coming to you actually with insights from Paris. All three of them were there just this morning. And so in the context of the AI Action Summit in Paris, this session will explore and debate the sort of international community's treatment of open source AI and the open source ecosystem in the UK. And they'll really dive deep into the benefits of open source AI. So bringing to you straight from Paris, we have Camilla de Veale from Mozilla, who will be moderating this panel. We are also joined by Elizabeth Seger from Demos and by Dave Buckley from OpenMined. So please join me in welcoming them for this panel. Thank you.
God, it feels a bit like school speech day. Anyway, thank you everyone so much for coming. This is the open source panel, and because the summit had a specific focus on open source, we were always going to run this panel. But because of DeepSeek exploding onto the scene, we're now extra topical. And so I'm going to moderate a short discussion with my lovely panelists on open source and the summit and the geopolitics of AI and what the UK can be doing about it. We're then going to break for questions, and I had a very cool party last night, so I've got one of the goodie bags from the party, and the best question, you guys get the goodie bag, so start thinking now. So I was going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves by saying where they come from, but also critically why they're interested in open source, why they work on it, why they think it is so critical. So I will turn first to Elizabeth to introduce herself.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Seger. I'm the Director of Digital Policy at a think tank called Demos. Demos is a cross-party political think tank. We've been around for about 30 years, based on Whitehall. And the purpose of Demos is our main goal is to strengthen democracy and put people at the heart of policymaking. One of the things that I love about working there on the digital policy unit and working on AI governance, is I like to say that unlike a lot of other tech think tanks that do a lot of stuff around AI and then sprinkle some public policy on top of it, we have a super firm grounding in public policy and social policy, and then can talk about how AI integrates with that. So then where does my interest in open source come from? I have a long background in AI governance topics and have worked on open source for quite a while, and open source policy. The reason mostly being that I'm a glutton for punishment. This is a really wicked problem. It's very difficult. Open source is so good, it's so great, but it's also very possible to be open about things that you don't want to be open about, and we can get ourselves into a lot of trouble. So how do we thread that needle? Working on this topic at Demos is also a wonderful opportunity just because of how central open source ecosystems are going to be for making sure that there's really an opportunity for AI to serve the broader public, and really democratize the access and benefit of this technology.
Thank you. Dave.
Hi, everyone. My name's Dave Buckley. I work in the policy team for an organization called OpenMined, with an E, importantly. So who is OpenMined is the obvious question. So we're a non-profit foundation. We build open source technology to enable, so this is data access infrastructure, to enable access and governance of sensitive information. So where you might have issues accessing data due to sort of privacy reasons, security reasons, intellectual property, how can you sort of govern that data and access it in a meaningful way whilst providing sort of meaningful oversight and governance. We sort of have a flagship product called PySift with a Y. So if you go on our GitHub or just Google PySift, you'll come across our work. And I suppose what we've been doing the past couple of years is sort of developing as a sort of open source community, this project which sort of emerged from more the sort of research academic community, and now sort of trying to really build sort of a robust infrastructure that can be used by organizations to sort of solve real problems. And we've been doing a bunch of different pilot projects, some more in sort of what I'd call generally like the research and innovation space. So we talk a lot about AI for healthcare, for example, which is a really obvious example of where you have super sensitive data that in theory, in principle, if you could really sort of have meaningful access and meaningful governance over that data, and you can sort of build tools in a way build AI tools in a way that really makes the most of that data, you could create really meaningful sort of healthcare interventions, etc. So we have some work there where we've collaborated with a lot of statistics offices around the world through the UN Statistics Division. So again, trying to help those kind of organizations to unlock the value of their data for public good use cases. We've also kind of been doing some work with private sector actors as well. So at the moment, we have a project working with Reddit, who are trying to develop a new researcher access API. So this idea of so much of our lives is increasingly mediated on social media platforms. How can external researchers gain insights into how platform algorithms, how recommender systems are potentially influencing the content we see, and how can we do that in a privacy-preserving way? So yes, do check out that work as well. And I guess we have like a sort of second stream of work, which is more around the sort of AI auditing space. So how can we make AI auditing a sort of more open, build more open tooling, I guess, for being able to do this in a meaningful way. So we've done some work over the past couple of years with the UK AI Safety Institute. So we ran a pilot with Anthropic. So trying to get at this idea of we want meaningful oversight of these systems, but obviously we're talking about proprietary systems where there are certain types of access that on the behalf of the AI provider, they might not want an external auditor to be able to access. At the same time, you have external evaluators who might have sort of information they want to use in their testing and their benchmark data, which they don't want to divulge to the other side, right? So we've kind of been building infrastructure that can enable this idea of mutual secrecy, so where you can enable these kind of more rigorous scientific evaluations by enabling this more granular access, but sort of provably through like cryptographic techniques, preventing either party from seeing information that they shouldn't see, if that makes sense. I guess then briefly just like to turn to why this panel on open source. So we're an open source organization. I think the main kind of angle here, I suppose, is like open source to enable digital public good infrastructure. So again, all the things I just mentioned, we see ourselves as trying to develop this sort of protocol for being able to use what we would broadly call non-public information. And hopefully, if we can do that in a sort of very open and transparent way, you can really maximize the public good you can extract from these kind of assets that we're talking about. So yeah, I suppose OpenMind's mission is to leverage open source, leverage the community, to build these kind of tools and technologies that can enable us to kind of ensure we're prioritizing the public good.
Thank you so much. And I'm Camilla from Mozilla, and I've been saying that since Sunday in Paris. And I realize it makes me sound a bit like a deranged children's TV presenter. But I do AI policy for the Mozilla Foundation in the UK. Obviously, Mozilla has worked on open source since its inception, and it's very, very interested in open source AI and indeed public interest, AI, to push the benefits of AI outwards. And I could, why am I interested in open source beyond that? I could give a sort of very prepared media quip about how, open source is the tool of the challenger. And I believe that, and that is why I do what I do. But I think for a UK-specific context, I'm very interested in the fact that, the UK has a lot of open source innovation within it. Open source is clearly an integral part of the innovation infrastructure for lots and lots of different reasons. And yet it's quite hard to see, and therefore I think it's quite hard to help. And we have a moment now where we're thinking about open source, and I'm not entirely sure the UK is necessarily fixed on it, and that's what I'm looking forward to discussing today. But I think we should start with the summit, because that's why we're all here. We've all been at the summit. We've all been in dank basements talking about how we need to balance innovation with safety. And I thought we would start maybe with just talking about the fact that this summit did focus on open source, which was quite notable. The other summits have not. And I think that, it's ended almost as quite a sort of fractious summit, and yet open source was the one thing that a lot of people were agreeing on. And I think it was notable that, Modi and von der Leyen all talked about open source. They all talked about how we need it more. And so I thought maybe I would start with Elizabeth. I'd start with you, and why it is so critical that the summit has talked about open source.
Well, I think what it comes down to is that at its core, open source is really central to this question of balancing those risks with the benefits. It comes back to the age-old adage. But actually, when you talk about open source, it's whether we have an AI safety summit or an AI action and opportunity summit, open source is a relevant point of conversation. In terms of talking about AI safety, this is about how models are shared, who has access to them. There are genuine concerns about opening up potential for misuse, and how do we manage that? There are questions, especially this year, that have been raised around international AI racing and the impact of open sourcing on that. But then also looking to the opportunities of open sourcing. Like I said, this is about distributing a technology and determining who has access to be able to build and capitalize on top of this technology. But also, Dave, as you were mentioning, who has the ability to evaluate these technology? Whose eyeballs are on it? Who gets to evaluate and make sure that these systems are really working for public benefit and public good? And I think where this all comes around, and why it was such a hot topic at this summit in particular, is because it all comes down to needing to underpin and drive a thriving open option alongside of what so many big techs are doing and the development that they're really spurring forward. And that development is great, and we should, having closed options have their value too. There's a lot of built-in infrastructure and support, and there will be many people and organizations who prefer to purchase the services of closed models and closed options. But that can't be the only option. There are corporations, people, entire governments who might not be able to afford that kind of access, and being able to develop on top of open source options is essential to making sure that really the entire world can benefit from this AI technology. It's about harnessing those opportunities, but also about making sure that we can have a worldwide view over the safety implications as well.
Yeah, and I think also just being able to personalize it, not have to wait for a company maybe like, well, I decide to make this for you, and you either decide to buy it or not. You can decide to sort of personally train something on what you need it to do. And unfortunately, I was hoping it would be released and published before this, and it's not been, but we have just conducted a survey with a couple of other foundations that will be published very soon, of over 700 CTOs using closed and open source models, and surveying them on why they do what they do, what are the barriers to adopting open source, and various different questions. And one of the most striking results that has so far come out is that if you believe that AI is critical to your business model in the future, you are more likely to use open source by something like 60%. And I think that speaks to how critical it is and why it's going to be so critical to competition. But moving to you, Dave, and data and your experience of the summit, how was it? And did you feel that the summit did enough to talk about your issues, or could that be something for the next summit? And how it integrates with open? Sorry.
Yes. How was it?
Yeah. How was it for you?
It was exhausting. That's what I say.
I think we're all running on about 3 hours of sleep up here.
A little bit. So set expectations low for the panel. No, I was. I think there's a couple of things that stick out for me. So particularly around the main summit itself. So one of the big sort of flagship initiatives that has come out is this new, I think they're calling it Current AI, which is an interesting choice of name. But this new sort of public good foundation, which I think has 400 million euros of initial funding. I think they're looking to fundraise maybe 2.5 billion over the next few years or something. But the idea that you have this sort of new foundation with an explicit remit to focus on public good AI, which in principle sounds really promising. And I think if you sort of, there's not too much information out there in the world at the moment, but they have announced these sort of initial, at a high level at least, I think it's about 10 flagship initiatives that are happening under that foundation. And there's a couple of parts in there specifically focused on data. So I was particularly encouraged to see this initiative being started called the Open Trusted Data Initiative, which I think is being run by the AI Alliance, which is a sort of consortium of different organizations and companies working in this space, where they essentially want to create curated data sets that are publicly available, that can be widely used, and are sort of AI-ready, quote unquote, which are, you are protecting the privacy that they need to protect, are giving copyright holders, rights holders, the rights, essentially enabling models to be trained in a way that is in line with copyright law. And that seems quite a positive step to be able to create something like that, could bring a lot of value. There are sort of similar initiatives where they're maybe more of a focus on sort of science data. So I think that then starts to get into some of the stuff that we're interested in, where you might have proprietary data sets or private data sets. And so Martin Tisney, who was was essentially leading this public interest AI track of the summit. I saw him talking quite a lot about the real need now is to enable us to access high quality data in order to train machine learning models and use machine learning models in these really valuable contexts. I think, so that was encouraging. I think the issue, as it always is, especially with data, is that the devil will be in the detail. Data access fundamentally is a really hard problem. This is kind of why we exist, I suppose. We're trying to solve this problem. So yes, I think the signs are encouraging from the main summit. I think, we'll see over the next year or so how well this will be operationalized, I suppose.
Yeah, and I thought it was very interesting, actually, that when at the launch of the fund, Martin was saying, if you're not the US and you're not China, you're all in the same boat, and that's why I'm doing what we're doing, which I thought was quite interesting. And it sort of almost feels like we've got the headlines about who and who's signed and who's not signed the summit declaration, but behind those headlines, you've got lots of money going into some quite interesting projects and lots of development going on. Which could be interesting. But was there something that both of you were like, okay, that's good, bank that, great, but I really wish the summit had explored, this more? Or was there something that you wish in the wider open ecosystem had been covered?
Yeah, I would have been interested in seeing more around regulation of open source, and I think it makes sense why they didn't touch on it so much from this isn't the safety summit, this is an opportunity summit, but there is an angle around regulation for open source that is about making the open source ecosystem competitive. And this is an issue I know we were talking about earlier, but the idea here is, if you have all this great regulation to make sure that closed models are safe and there's guarantees around them, and if you use them, you don't have any liability concerns, people are going to go for just the closed models. We have this great closed ecosystem, and the open option, the parallel open option we were just talking about, that valuable parallel open option goes away. So having some deeper discussion around what does it take to give the same kinds of guidelines and assurances around open models as well, so that people see that not just as the option you go to when you have no other choice, but as a real viable and maybe even preferable option is really important. And obviously there's some complication here. We don't have that nicely regulatable point of release like with closed models, but we can think much more broadly about the kind of regulation and safeguards that can happen throughout the AI lifecycle, not just thinking about model release. We can think about what kind of steps need to happen earlier in the development process. We can think about where the data comes from and regulations around training data sets. We can look at the hosting platforms like Hugging Face and GitHub and who hosts these problems and what kind of requirements do they have for setting certain standards or removing content and models that are used for particular nefarious purposes. And there is no silver bullet. We can't put all the responsibility on one person. But I think having these deep conversations about the standard setting and the guidelines throughout the AI lifecycle is going to be hugely important for open source to make it competitive and viable. So I would have liked to see more conversation about regulation, but not from this. I also care deeply about safety, but even if not from the safety standpoint, from the let's make this viable standpoint.
Definitely, and again, one of the results coming out of the survey that will soon be published is one of the clearest barriers to adopting open so far that people think is compliance and worrying about can they demonstrate that they have complied. So I completely agree.
No, I think as well, just building on that, we shouldn't forget sort of the advantages of open source in principle in this space. So the fact, I guess some of the access challenges I was alluding to earlier, where you have closed models, like can you audit these in as rigorous a way as you might want to? You don't have those problems with open source models, right? Because everything, the weights are available, you can do that kind of research, but I guess it's like the broader ecosystem we build up around that.
Yeah.
It feels like to date.
I found it quite funny with the release of DeepSeek. Everyone's freaking out about how capable DeepSeek is and how terrible and all the terrible things that people might use it for. It is also now the most heavily scrutinized model that's out there. Like, it has been evaluated more deeply and more thoroughly than any other model on the planet. So the benefits of open source.
Exactly.
Well, of the bits that you can.
Of the bits that you can
Yes,
access.
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. We could get into a DeepSeek.
We could get into a
conversation,
DeepSeek.
can't we?
Why don't you? Because let's do that, because I've written 3 things. What I was going to say was, originally when we were thinking about putting this panel on, we were going to have a section on sort of the geopolitics of AI, because it is tightening and you can't stockpile AI models. And I was going to do something about, open source helps you be an AI maker and not an AI taker, and helps you be more resilient. But now we've got DeepSeek to actually talk about. And I think I was sort of going to say 3 statements and see whether you agreed with me. And I realized that obviously there are still things emerging about DeepSeek, and so this is very, very surface level, but I was going to say, it demonstrates that open models can be as good or better than closed at a fraction of the cost, and therefore we have a completely new understanding of the AI landscape as a result. It's a reminder that Europe and the UK can use open as a strong competitive advantage, and if we don't, we're sort of currently on track to see China set quite a lot of standards almost by default. Which I don't think we really want to see. So I was going to sort of use that to launch into a discussion whether you agreed or disagreed, or whether you had other elements that when DeepSeek came onto the scene that you were thinking, oh, that's really interesting for how this will change the landscape.
Yeah, so like any good
you.
panel answer, the answer is both yes and no.
Fantastic.
So I guess, yes, there is a level at which I agree that it has shown how open models can be so good and so capable, and shows that there is an opportunity for the EU and the UK to play ball with capable models on a similar level. I worry about getting ahead of ourselves in terms of talking about what it exactly is that DeepSeek is and has done and has achieved. And I think the important thing to remember about this model is that it's basically, it was a fancy fine-tuning process that got us to DeepSeek. This is not a model that was built from scratch. We took a different generative AI model, trained it on the reasoning data from things like OpenAI's O1 model, and then are able to develop a model that can mimic that can perform that same kind of reasoning capability, but it was very much bootstrapped on the capabilities of other models. And the reason that's important is because I think while it shows that at very low cost, we can develop a highly capable model that is on the same level as these other foundation models, it still shows that there is a very important and essential role for foundational model development and research still to play, and that we can't do the things like DeepSeek without those models. And in a way, this is kind of a rehashing of the same panic attack everyone was having when fine-tuning first became a thing.
Yeah.
Like the first models that were fine-tuned, everyone was like, oh my God, the end of open source. and that was, this is it. And then we all calmed down, and then DeepSeek came out, and it's just like slightly fancier fine-tuning based on a new change in models that happened that was spearheaded by OpenAI. And I think when OpenAI came out with their O1 model, they thought that they had like maybe 6 months before the rest of the world caught up, and slightly shorter timeline. So I think that's the one thing, is just like not getting ahead of ourselves. So like absolutely, it shows that open source models can be as good in capability. I don't know that open source development, that means that open source development as a whole has caught up to frontier AI development. In terms of the EU and the UK being able to play ball and catch up, just like China has done, I think it comes back to the same reasoning around what do we mean by catch up? It is an ability to build on top of and mimic and imitate, which is hugely important, I think, from an application standpoint. The fact that you can get these capabilities with much lower compute investment, time investment, that is amazing, and that is huge for downstream application development and making sure that this is not just the purview of a handful of massive tech companies. That's really great. Maybe more on the international stage and thinking what does this mean for the EU and the UK being on a level playing field? No, we're not quite there. Anyway, that's my rant.
I'm going to put a pin in that because I want to come back to that.
Okay.
No, well, I'm going to classically sit on the fence, but I'm not going to present any hugely spicy takes, I don't think. But I guess presumably what we're going to see, I think Elizabeth, you're much more like in the technical detail on this than I am, but I would imagine we'll see these innovations that have been made in sort of the training process that DeepSeek has came up with. Presumably, many of those will now be replicated in the closed source models over the coming months. And I guess like that's just an example of how like the open source ecosystem works. So I don't know. I was of the mind of like a couple of weeks ago, I like went on my LinkedIn feed and just everybody had a take. So I just kind of signed out for a week or so. But yeah, I guess it points to the way to. There are going to be more innovations like this as well, and maybe this also goes back to some of the stuff that Martin was saying in this new foundation. One of the areas they want to explore is like, can you also just train smaller models? And maybe as well, this will show sort of there are different ways that you can approach these. You can build these kind of models. There's not just this sort of this narrative that we're going to build this sort of one singular AGI that's going to be owned by one single lab on the west coast of the US. But maybe there is going to be actually a lot more innovation. We're going to have a much more pluralistic, I suppose, set of models around the world, maybe trained in different ways, and things are going to keep developing. Like compute is going to be important, data is going to be important. There are going to be new innovations that can lead to sort of efficiencies like this. But yeah, I think there's still a lot more to come. But I don't know. I appreciated the sort of, it broke through that narrative perhaps, which I think is important, because I think maybe a lot of that narrative, it's a story that is being told. And I think actually seeing that, there are alternative ways that we can make breakthroughs and sort of progress on this stuff, I think is interesting.
I have a question for you.
Go on.
How, with these breakthroughs, and making these breakthroughs, if it requires building off of models that are shared by, say, like Meta with their Llama models, and then you build off of those and fine-tune and so on, what does it mean for the open source ecosystem if frontier labs decide that this is not a viable structure anymore, and say Meta doesn't open source their frontier models anymore, and basically if Meta stops opening their frontier models, what does that mean for that open source ecosystem and actually having that, because if you need to, sorry, I'm not articulating well, but because I'm not sure that it's a sustainable model. Like, these are expensive.
Yeah, exactly. And I've seen, there's some statements that have come out of the US government that are, I guess, being more protectionist around this kind of stuff, right? It's like, well, like having seen like Jan LeCun speak a couple of times last week, and obviously he's very, very much a proponent of open source AI. So if Meta were to do that, I guess Jan would have a lot to answer for, or he would quit, I don't know. I don't really know how the geopolitics are going to play out with this.
I was just curious what it would mean for the broader open source ecosystem. We want this independent, thriving ecosystem, but is it actually all hinging on the existence of a couple benevolent actors who put out their models? And if so, how do we make sure that that's not the case? I don't know if anyone here has answers. I'm just.
Well, no, I'm really looking forward to the questions now. But in terms of like what do we do about that?
Yes.
I suppose just bring it back to the UK, given that we're at the London AI Fringe. The UK government, they say they want to inject AI into their veins. What should we be doing for the open source? He literally did. What should we be doing to boost open source in the UK?
We should be getting a different comms department is the first thing.
Right, okay, a different comms department.
That's regardless of boosting AI, that's just to deal with these levels.
Okay, cool. What should we be doing in the UK to boost open source innovation? We had the AI Opportunities Plan. What grade would you give it for open source?
Ooh.
2.5.
Right.
Maybe.
Low grade then, 2.5.
Low grade.
Is there any explicit reference to open source?
Yes,
there is
one. In the procurement section.
Okay, yeah. I think the procurement reform feels like a useful area where you could make...
Basically, it says we should procure open source as and when possible. And that is kind of the extent of the mention, which I think is a good start, and I agree. I think my issue with it mainly is that was the only mention. I mean, the UK talks about this AI Opportunities Plan and how we can capitalize on the opportunities of AI and grow our industry and grow our economy around AI. And the main focus seems to be around really around tapping into, like, let's also be a frontier AI developer and a player in that game. And so like, okay, we can maybe claim third place in the world, but there's a big gap between us and the leaders. I mean, let's keep working, let's keep a finger in the game, but really, I think the opportunities for the UK are solidly going to be in downstream application development. We have thriving startup industry already in that space. Let's capitalize on that. And that kind of downstream development is going to thrive if there is a thriving open source ecosystem for it to build on. These are companies that cannot afford to start from scratch with these massive models. But the economic opportunity of building on those models is huge. So that's one thing I think that was a huge missed opportunity in the opportunities plan, was talking about the importance of open source for that downstream application development. And I think the other point, it was touched on, but I think could have been fleshed out a lot more, was around building an assurance ecosystem, a third-party assurance ecosystem in the UK. And this because it's something that UK and especially industry in London does very well. We provide assurance as a service for tons of different industries. And we have the AI Safety Institute, which has brought an unprecedented amount of globally leading AI talent into government. And we can really capitalize on that to build a third-party AI assurance ecosystem in the UK to help evaluate and provide some of this certainty around the downstream model development and around open source ecosystems. But then you also need transparency into models and into data in order to have that kind of thriving ecosystem. So that's why I give it such a low grade. I like the things that they said. It was about the things that they didn't say. And I think there are some, like, yeah, we can talk about frontier, but I think the big opportunities for the UK, the ones that we are set up and ready to capitalize on now, are the downstream application development and really leaning into this assurance ecosystem. And that all depends on having a thriving open source ecosystem.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Dave, did you want to come in?
I just bring it back to data, because I guess I'm the data guy.
Yeah.
So obviously, like, the big thing that sort of was in the Labour manifesto and is now sort of in this Opportunities Action Plan as well, is like this idea of a national data library, which nobody knows what it is yet, but I guess is being defined. And I think, like, that feels like, again, like, in parts of particularly in the UK public sector, think of the NHS as like the obvious example, like, we do have these like super valuable data assets, right? We have health records going back, 50, 60, 70 years. And there does seem to be this sort of impetus now with this idea of a national data library, that if you could, in principle, enable both researchers and also startups and SMEs potentially to have targeted access to public sector data assets. Again, you could create these sort of downstream applications that bring a lot of value to improve people's lives, improve public services, all this kind of thing. I guess what I would argue for, and what would, with my sort of OpenMined hat on, is, again, if you want sort of maximum transparency to foster trust in how sort of public sector data is being used, then if you can encourage the use of like open source frameworks for doing the data access, for being transparent around, okay, which organizations are using this data for what purposes, I think that goes a long, long way to building trust. Compared to the sort of opposite way, whereas if this was all a sort of private endeavor and is very sort of closed access to a small set of companies, that feels like you're, again, going back to the public good point, potentially you're having public good AI in that you're generating sort of really valuable use cases, but it's sort of which public are you serving? So can we sort of broaden access rather than sort of have a narrow set of people with access?
Yeah, and you brought up the point earlier also about having open access to like safety tooling and evaluation methodology as well. So it's not just opening the systems, but can you provide access to the resources you need to evaluate and test your systems and record information about them and standardize that process, and that will go a huge way towards even just standardize how we talk about the safety of open source models would go a huge way in helping us understand a lot about the safety of open source models.
Definitely. I also just think, and I mean, I would agree with what you've both said, and also there are many things within the AI Opportunities Plan that will sort of help open source by like osmosis, because it will help innovation, it will help the people who are building, certainly. But yeah, I agree. I wish there was, more the government could have said about, like, we will sit, as part of our AI industrial strategy, we will sit and think about an open source strategy. And when they're talking about, sector champions for different sectors that the AI will disrupt, have an open source champion. Like, the data that we have on open source in the UK is actually in places quite patchy. Like, we could collect a bit more of that. So yeah, I think there was a lot more that we could be doing. And I look forward to, yes, the National Data Library and talking about that. I realise we're nearly at time and I do want to leave time for questions. So I thought I would just close with, what do you both hope the summit will do, as I have a specific look at next year, if anything?
Are we assuming that
I mean, clearly the
AI
geopolitics of
safety
AI
summit is no longer... Okay,
Sorry.
I was saying, like, is this no longer... Because, I mean, it was an AI safety summit, and then it was going to be... And then
it was
opportunity...
The Opportunity
Action-
Summit and the
Action
Everything Summit. Yeah.
Okay.
What are you hoping it will be? What's the adjective you use?
I would say international coordination would be really helpful. We failed miserably in this summit for international coordination, but that's what, like, if we're going to have any kind of meaningful regulation for AI, open source or not, we need a way to coordinate internationally on that. And
Okay.
if that's the focus, I think we might actually have a hope of doing something around it.
So the AI International Coordination Summit.
Sure.
Can't wait. Dave.
Yeah, well, it's a big question. I do. So going to the summit this past week, like, getting all these people together in a city and going to all these side events with, like, really knowledgeable people who are doing, like, really hands-on, on-the-ground work is, like, super, super valuable in itself. But then I think there's this, a clearly big problem of the last week has been the main summit itself, and sort of the main purpose that I originally thought these summits were being set up for was exactly this international coordination piece, right? And I guess given what happened in Bletchley, and then sort of Korea, and these voluntary commitments, which labs have then followed up with these safety frameworks, felt like maybe there was a clear next step to sort of continue coordination around that, potentially enshrine some of that in law. But I guess the political climate has changed so much recently that we failed miserably, as you say. I guess, like, my sort of cop-out answer would be everything at the moment just seems to be moving so fast that I don't really know how you can decide now what we should be talking about in a year. But yeah, I think the one thing I would say, I think is probably just echoing Elizabeth, is it would be nice if we could bring the US and the UK, importantly.
Maybe another way to approach it is, what do you not want the summit to be? I wouldn't want it to turn into basically just like a AI roadshow. Yeah.
Another
Okay.
party.
And a party.
That's a good vision to end with.
Cool.
If anyone would like to ask a question, we have got a bit of time. I would remind you, very cool goodie bag. There are microphones roving. If you could just say your name and the organisation you represent would be fantastic. This gentleman over here.
Hello, I'm Dave Gibbons, and I'm from the University of Southampton. I wanted to say thank you. It's been a brilliant discussion. And something Camilla said right at the start of the session was about open source being hard to see. So where can the average person on the street start to look and start to avoid those big kind of closed options that seem to be everywhere and difficult to avoid?
Okay, interesting question. I didn't realise I would be doing marketing for open source, apart from Firefox, obviously. Guys, how do we avoid closed source if you want to?
I think the answer is, if you're talking about the average person on the street right now, it is very difficult. The easiest way for most people to interact with AI right now is to go to an interface like ChatGPT or Anthropic's Claude. And I mean, I think this is the point of the discussion around needing that bigger, thriving open source ecosystem. I don't know how we get to that, and maybe this is something you can talk to as well, Camilla, because I think there always will be a bit of a gap between those who can take an go to Hugging Face, download an open source model, and like spin it up on their own computer and do something with it, and the average person who just wants to access and benefit from the use of these technologies. And that will always be through some kind of an interface, which will be provided by someone who's either developed a technology themselves or has built on an open source technology and is providing that service. So I'm not sure how to bridge that gap, but maybe more insight to that part of the equation, the point of service.
I don't have particularly more insight right now, but I do think we're quite early, and there is so much that's happening, and that's partly why we're doing what we're doing, because we want more people to innovate. So it sounds like a cop-out, but ask me again in 5 years. Sorry, who else wanted a question? We're going to go all the way back up there, and then I will come down here. Thank you very much. Sorry. Thank you, whoever lowered the lights, because I can now see the audience.
Hi there, my name is Adam Ellis Palmer. I'm a graduate student at King's. I'm actually missing class to be here, but I think my professors will be okay with that.
Okay.
I'm in a digital governance class in our digital humanities department, and studying the sort of different theories of actors and governance in the digital space. And the first lecture was community-based governance. And my entire module was extremely pessimistic about any form of sort of productive commons and community-based governance. And even my professors took note of that. So I kind of wanted to know what each of you say to the pessimists and skeptics maybe in this room, in the industry, and basically an entire generation of young people who have grown up online and with AI who kind of believe we're subservient to state and corporate power. So, and how does open source kind of change that prevailing mentality?
So
thank you.
Yeah, great.
That is a heavy question.
Yeah,
Sorry.
heavy question. But I think there is actually a pretty straightforward answer to it, which is, like, open source this is not something new that's happened with AI. Open source has been around, like, it's foundational to the internet. And open source itself has a long and very strong history of being a well-functioning, community-based, community-governed endeavor. With really strong standards and internal oversight, and it has worked well. And yes, there are issues, there are vulnerabilities, but in general, the benefits outweigh the risks, and we're able to mount that defense. So I think open source in itself is the answer to your question. We have a huge, long history of it. The question is how and to what extent does that translate into the AI era? And there's a lot of really interesting work going on around trying to pull apart the differences between open source software and open source AI, and how different dynamics might be at play. But anything you'd like to add?
I just add there are lots of sort of bottom-up initiatives that are happening on this very problem. I very much sympathize with the view that, like, the powers that you're competing with are really powerful companies, right? So it is really hard to change this ecosystem, and I think this is a multi-year effort. But I don't think there is hope, right? And I think, again, this is probably building on what Elizabeth was saying. I think most of us go about our day-to-day, like, unaware that there's all this open source infrastructure that is essentially is digital public good infrastructure that we're relying on all the time, all the foundational layers of the internet, all the encryption schemes that we're relying on for everything, even like in the machine learning community, right? If you're a data scientist or whatever, you're using all these open source libraries all the time, regardless of what companies you work at and things like this. So, yeah, and I was just reflecting as well on, there's a couple of events I was at in Paris last week. So there was a whole sort of symposium day that was on participatory AI research. So there's like lots of cool initiatives that are happening. I'd encourage you to check out a thing called the Public AI Network, who wrote a really cool paper on sort of envisioning what an alternative future could look like, relying on these kind of tools. But yes, I think there is hope, but these things take time.
Okay, in our closing minutes, there's a question just over there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I come from the sort of safety side of the house, and on the question of open source, I'm agnostic. Now, obviously, as a panel, you put together supporters of of the open source. Can I ask you, each of you, to articulate what would you consider the strongest arguments for those putting the other side of the case?
Interesting. Dave, do I start with you?
Should I do a quick version, which is the alternative is you have, as I was saying earlier, is that you put all that power in the hands of one company? That doesn't feel like a particular...
Oh, no, I think we're being asked for arguments that we would want to argue against the strongest case for anti-open source. So for me, for example, I would say it's probably control. Because if you control the tool, then you can control access to it and you control what people do with it. Personally, I don't think in the long run that's actually that helpful, but I think it's quite a strong argument. Mm-hmm. Sorry.
Yeah, and in the panel of open source supporters, I've actually written quite critically about open source, is how I actually started more my foray into this field. But I think, yes, on the control point, I think there are very strong arguments from a national security perspective. If you talk to people in national security circles, they are very worried about open source and the vulnerabilities that it provides. I think overall the benefits of open source do outweigh those vulnerabilities, but when we talk about misuse risks and national security vulnerabilities, that's the strongest approach for me.
I would agree with that.
Thank you so much for my panel, and I'm giving the goodie bag to the heavy question up there to the man that's missing class. Anyway, if you want to, thank you so much for listening.